Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Welcome to Nightlight, everybody. So good of you to come and join with us and share your evening and your time with us. Mark has a great show tonight. You're going to thoroughly enjoy it. He's got one of my favorite authors on with him. But before that, I want to thank Ken Quiethawk for his amazing intro. He and his wife have an amazing website, nativestorytellers.com. And it's a modality that everyone should experience. Try listening in on some of their stories and understand how they held and they shared their history and their mythology with stories that were given generation to generation to generation. They're amazing, they're phenomenal, and it's a wonderful way of passing history from generation to generation. So please feel free to check out that website and listen to that unbelievable voice. So, Mark, welcome to the show. You've got a great guest tonight.
Hey, how are you? Oh, yeah.
Fabulous.
Have you been having a good week?
Oh, so far, so good. Yep.
Okay, good. You know, we've been collaborating on shows for, it's like 14 months now. And of the 58 shows we've done, unless YouTube's taken down another one because it was just too good.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, we just had too much information in that one. Contrary to the rumor, I've never done one of those 58 shows naked from my garage. I just want to let you know.
Thank God.
Okay. Yeah, you've seen our guest investigating giants on the Vieira Brothers Lost History of the Giant show. That was on the History Channel a few years ago, and he and Hugh Newman were investigating the outlying stones associated with the Upton Chamber. And he's becoming a staple on Nightlight. Yeah, David Brody just published his 12th novel. It's and it's entitled Treasure Templari. It's the 10th novel in his Templars in America series. He is an attorney and former director of NERA, and you can learn more about David by going to davidbrodybooks.com. Hi, Dave. How are you?
Good evening, Mark and Barbara. Good to be with you guys tonight. And I, too, am not naked in my garage, so that's good news.
Yeah. We just have to clarify that we had an incident recently.
No, you know what? I don't think I even want to hear it. I'm just going to make the comment. I'm not in my garage. I'm at my desk in suburban Boston, up on the North Shore of Massachusetts, and looking forward to spending 2 hours with you guys.
Okay. Yeah, we better get into
Leave it there.
the book review before the censors take this show down too. And I think a lot of the listeners are probably going to be more familiar with tonight's topic, the socio-economic, religious background of your book, Treasure Templari, then they may realize as we get started. A lot of the listeners, probably remember, reading Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. The wife of Bath had been on a pilgrimage to Cologne, which is supposedly the resting place of the three wise men. She wore the latest fashions from Ghent. The merchant, the merchant also had some of the latest fashions from Flanders. The best of all the tales, the Partner's Tale, was set in Flanders, and Bruges was the setting of the Shipman's Tale. So these Northern European settings are only what about 2 generations? Maybe only 30 years apart from the writing of the Canterbury Tales in like the mid 1380s to the mid 1390s, and the Ghent Alterpiece was written in the Ghent Alterpiece was painted in the 1420s.
Right,
We aren't taught.
Yes, you're right. So the Ghent Alterpiece, a very famous piece of art, was painted in Ghent, Belgium. It was begun in the 1420s by the brothers Hubert and Jan van Eyck, and it was finished around 1432. Right, and so that's sort of the trigger to this entire novel, Treasure Templari. And I thought you were going to go a different direction, Mark. I thought you were going to say your listeners are familiar with it because they saw the movie The Monuments Men back in 2014 with George Clooney and Matt Damon and Bill Murray, because that was a famous movie and where after World War II the Allied forces go in and recover the stolen art that the Nazis took, and this piece of art, the Ghent Alterpiece, is featured prominently in that story. So you went back to the Canterbury Tales, but I thought you were just going to go to Monuments Men with your story there. So you had me going in the wrong direction.
Now I was trying to incorporate that 10 years of college. My parents want to see some kind of dividends from those 10 years. But, I heard the English Blog Talk Robo Babe is going to double my salary this year too. But it's I was just trying to work in something where there is kind of a contemporary thing between Chaucer and the Van Eyck brothers, but there is that in your book there is a shift from where the Renaissance was really kind of taking off in Italy, and in Northern Europe was it was just kind of budding there, but we have a lot of really interesting things happening. Some of the relics are being moved up to the Northern European cities like Cologne and places like that.
what people don't realize when people, and let's back up and give it sort of an establishing shot here. I write a lot about the Knights Templar and what happened during the 200 years of their prominence, and then also what happened after they were outlawed. Why were they outlawed? How did they reach such prominence to begin with? What happened to their treasures afterwards? But what people don't realize about the Templars, people associate them with being mostly from France, and of course a lot of them were French, but a lot of them also came from an area we now call, or was called, Flanders, and that's the area in Belgium and the Netherlands where a lot of this, like for example, this painting, the Ghent, Ghent is in that area, Bruges, but there was a huge Templar presence there, and as you said, Mark, a lot of the relics that came from the Crusades ended up coming up into that area of Europe. There's a great little church in Bruges called the Basilica of the Holy Blood, where apparently a little vial of Jesus' blood is displayed, and tourists line up to this day. I was there a couple summers ago, in line there to go and view this little vial of Jesus' blood. But that area of Europe has a really strong tie to the Knights Templar, and we'll get into that as we continue our visit tonight. But one of the interesting clues about this Ghent Alterpiece and some of the mystery behind it, it ties into the Duke of Burgundy, who ruled that entire area of Europe during that time period. So, I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but yeah, so just to sort of set this whole thing up, that when we're talking about this area of Europe, we're talking about an area that had strong Templar influence and strong Templar history to it.
Okay, and we probably need to establish what the Ghent Alterpiece is for the listeners. So,
good. Okay. Yeah. Great. That's a great place to start. So the best way to describe the Ghent Alterpiece, NPR, National Public Radio, refers to it as arguably the most important painting in history. Okay. What it is it's this massive. An altarpiece is a piece of artwork, of course, that sits in front of an altar. It's 16 panels. And the reason it's so prominent, the reason it's so important is up until then, there were color paintings, of course, but they weren't really all that vibrant. The Van Eyck brothers figured out a way to create this amazing vibrancy by mixing pigments with linseed oil. And so they ended up with this bright colors that had never been seen before. And in addition, they were meticulous about drawing in detail, which no one had done before either. In such detail that, for example, you could see every individual hair on a horse. So really what this was, picture going from black and white television to color TV and high def, all in one fell swoop. That's what this painting was. We went from black and white immediately to high def color, and people were just blown away by it. People came from all over Europe to see this painting. Again, this is 1432 in something called St. Bavo's Cathedral in Ghent, in Belgium. And the history of that painting going forward, it then became the most stolen piece of artwork in history. It's been stolen 6 different times. And, again, we talked about it. It was featured in the Monuments Men movie. And one of the things about it that the reason that I ended up writing about it is the 16 panels. One of those panels was stolen before World War II in 1934, and that panel has never been recovered. And it's that panel called the Just Judges panel. That panel, Adolf Hitler believed was a secret map leading to the Holy Grail and the lost treasure of the Knights Templar. And he was obsessed with finding it. It's to this day still has never been recovered. But the idea that panel, one of the panels in this painting, might be a map to the Holy Grail, just is fascinating. Hitler's number one man, number one assistant, Himmler disagreed with Hitler. He said, no, it's not a map to the Holy Grail. It's actually a map that leads us back to ancient Atlantis. Both of them believed that what they were going to find by following this map, whether it was the Arma Christi from the Holy Grail or the technology of Atlantis would allow the Nazis to win World War II. So crazy stuff going on, all with this painting, though. But again, it all starts because of the evolution in both the vibrancy of color and also the detail in which every little piece of the painting was completed.
Okay, and it seems that the central painting is the one with the sacrificial lamb on the altar, and you get throngs of people arriving for the scene from all different angles of the painting.
Right. So the centerpiece and the largest piece, the largest panel in the painting is something called the Adoration of Mystic Lamb. And like you said, it's got a lamb on an altar in the middle, and it's surrounded by all the important figures of the Old and New Testaments, the angels, the judges, the prophets. The lamb is being sacrificed, and you can see the blood flowing out of the chest of the lamb into a chalice. So again, that's the lamb is a common symbol for Jesus, and this is obviously the sacrifice of the lamb, sacrifice of Jesus, and the blood flowing into the chalice is symbolic of the Holy Grail, and this is pretty basic symbology in this painting. Everyone is there watching. Off to one side, watching this event, are a group of knights on horseback, Knights of Christ, which are the successor order to the Knights Templar. And then beyond them are a group of contemporary figures, noblemen of Europe, and they're called the Just Judges. They're also on horseback. It's these Just Judges. It's this panel is the one that was stolen in 1934 and never recovered, that is supposedly the secret map to the Holy Grail and the treasure of the Templars. But it's the Just Judges who are behind the Knights of Christ. Remember, the Knights of Christ, the quote-unquote, the Knights of Christ, the successor to the Templars, were quote-unquote heretics. They had been outlawed in 1307. So one of the questions right away is, why is this outlawed order? Why are they featured so prominently and so close to the center of religious painting that's been displayed in a Catholic cathedral, St. Pablo's Cathedral? So that's one of the things I think Hitler was wondering about as a potential clue. Now, of course, it's always dangerous to try to get inside the mind of Adolf Hitler, but what was it about this painting and that panel in particular that made Hitler think it was a secret map? Partly, I think it was because of the inclusion of the Templars in the painting. So that was a potential clue he and others thought.
Okay, and since we don't have the painting to study, it's been photographed, and we'll get to that shortly. But what was the kind of Atlantean technology that Hitler and Himmler also discussed that could be represented in this painting that would help them to win the Second World War?
All right. So Hitler thought that the painting led to what we'll call the Arma Christi, the implements used in the crucifixion of Jesus. So specifically the true cross, the spear of destiny, the crown of thorns. Hitler believed that those things could be weaponized because they were magical, and also used by himself to give himself the fountain of youth, permanent life, to make himself immortal. That he like Jesus could have he could come back to life and become immortal. That this Arma Christi, he could find these things and again use them not only to win the war but also to continue to rule the world indefinitely. Himmler, as part of the Aryan belief that the Aryans tied their history back to the northern Scandinavians, and also going back even further to what they believe was the ancient Atlantis civilization. He believed that the map led to some kind of underground portal or hiding place or cave in which the technology of Atlantis could be found. And remember the stories of Atlantis, they were able to do things like levitation. They had amazing weaponry. They had technology far beyond what other people had at that time period, whether we're talking 12, 15,000 years ago, in that range. So both Himmler and Hitler were obsessed with this painting, and the map they believed was embedded in it, but for sort of different reasons. But in the end, both of them thought that what they were going to find could be weaponized and used by the Nazis to win World War II.
Okay, and to take the Atlantean theme a little bit deeper, you do work in the is it Dunvedenstone Circle that's also located in the Netherlands as maybe a part of the Atlantean culture, or maybe one of the outposts that you bring up from your previous book, Echoes of Atlantis. We can save that for later.
Sure.
But you do bring up this stone circle that you. I assume you visited that one.
I'm sorry. You said I'm sorry. You're talking about the Hunebedden site in the Netherlands. Hunebedden. Yes.
Oh yeah. I missed that day in school on the official Dutch pronunciation.
Hunebedden means giant beds. So that's the
giants.
So giant beds.
Okay.
So the Hunebedden, there's a site in the Netherlands. And yes, I did visit it. It was fascinating. There's actually about 60 different sites, 60 different Hunebedden sites, and they're clustered near the German border in the northeast part of the Netherlands. And what they are these giant boulders that somehow came across from Scandinavia. Either they floated across during the Ice Age, or they were dragged across by ancient man. But they're arranged oftentimes in circles. These are boulders the size of refrigerators, of sleeper sofas. The smaller ones are about the size of reclining chairs. They're massive, and they're stacked up oftentimes two on the ground and one sort of atop it like a bridge, almost like an arch. And the reason they're called giant beds is the ancient people thought maybe they were built by giants as sleeping areas. And they're fascinating. But one of the possibilities that my characters talk about in the book is, could these things be evidence of the ancient Atlantis civilization? Because again, these things were moved across hundreds of miles, open sea. Who could have done this? Who would have had the technology to do this? And then also the strength. And so when we talk about, of course, ancient Atlantis, one of the things that we read about is that these were oversized people. I don't use the word giants, but they were big, strong, much bigger people than other peoples of that time period. And so when we start talking about these massive formations and giants' beds, I guess we do have to talk about giants a little bit. So the ancient peoples believed these formations, actually these arrangements, are not formations, they're man-made, believed these things may have been tied back to the ancient Atlantis culture.
Okay. It does make sense, the positioning of them, or like on the eastern edge of the North Sea, general, it's somewhere in that vicinity, and you do and mention the outposts all along the both sides of the Atlantic seashore, in the echoes of Atlantis. And when Greg Little was on talking about it at Atlantis with Barbara a couple months ago, he was also discussing like Bimini, could be like one of these outposts too. So that does sound like a possibility.
Right. So when you talk about Atlantis, everyone agrees. Not everyone agrees where it is, but everyone does agree that it was an island in the middle of the ocean someplace. Whether some people think inside the Mediterranean, I think it was along the in the Mid-Atlantic ridge, in the middle of the Atlantic. And wherever it was, everyone agrees it was a seafaring society, and so they would have had outposts clustered around. Including areas of the North Sea, which is what we're talking about here. So so the pieces sort of hold together, and even if Atlantis itself was destroyed by some cataclysmic event, as Plato tells us, there would have likely have been a few, at least, members of their society or ships with crews that were out in trading missions or somehow able to survive the cataclysmic event, and then they would have had to find a new place to settle, presumably along the coastline someplace. And so we see these evidence of some of the technology and some of the cultural things that we think may have gone on in Atlantis in places like the Orkney Islands off the north of Scotland. We have some of these red paint burial sites along the maritime Canada down into the Gulf of Mexico and then across into the Iberian Peninsula area. The Iberian Peninsula has some fascinating cave art and other cultural discoveries that seem to predate what we now believe is the existing timeline of cultural discoveries. Things like ceramics that were fired in a kiln going back over 20,000 years, which we always thought that the Chinese discovered the art of ceramics 10,000 years ago, but this looks like it's 20,000 years ago. And the cave art in the Pyrenees area of between France and Spain, some of that cave art goes back 25,000 years, long before people should have been able to do things like that, to have established the ability to have sophisticated pieces of artwork. And so anyway, we see these clusters of discoveries that don't fit in the existing timeline. They're outliers. And one of the possibilities is that we can explain these outliers through the vehicle of an ancient civilization such as Atlantis. That Atlantis, the existence of Atlantis, may explain why we have these outlying discoveries that don't seem to fit in with what we know about in Europe at the time, yet there they are. So, as you said, Mark, the idea that these rock formations, these rock arrangements, would exist near the northern coast of Europe along the waterways, that makes sense. That's exactly where you'd expect to find stuff like that.
Yeah. Just establishing some of the early themes you wrote about, and so let's take a moment to shift from the European setting to the Catskills for a minute, and establish the setting there, and what creates a lot of the international intrigue in your novel.
Right. So this is a common theme in all my novels. This idea that when the Templars were outlawed, and even before the Templars were outlawed, at some point the Templars probably figured out that they were going to butt heads with the church and were going to be outlawed, and that the church would someday turn on them. So even before they were outlawed, and definitely afterwards, the Templars understood that they needed a safe haven. They needed a place to go to escape the long arm of the church. That what they believed, and I think they believed this. I think their beliefs were formed by their years in the Middle East, where they were exposed to different ideas, different events that made them start to question the orthodoxy of the church back in Europe. I think they learned different things while in the Middle East, and that's in the end why they butted heads with the church. But they understood that because they were butting heads with the church, because their beliefs were not orthodox, because they may not have shared with in the patriarchal rigidity of the medieval church, that eventually they were going to need a safe haven, need a place to go to hide their treasures and themselves. And so I think early on they started looking across the Atlantic, and that we have some fascinating journals that talk about an excursion by Knights Templar members to the Catskill Mountains region of New York in the late 1100s. And then later I've written about the Prince Henry Sinclair journey in 1398, 1399, again coming across from Scotland to the New England coastline. And I'm guessing there are, those are two that we think we know about. I'm guessing there are many others in between that we don't know about. This was a secret society, and they were operating in secret on purpose because they were trying to hide themselves and their treasures from the church. And so obviously a lot of this is not in the historical record. But when you mention the Catskills, in my book, one of the things the characters are suspicious of or wondering about is, did the Templar treasure end up in America when this group of Templars came to the Catskills in the 1180s, in that time period, 1179, 1180, in that time period? Is that one of the things that they were doing? Were they bringing across some of their secrets, some of their treasures? Were they scouting for locations, and then later they brought them across? You don't. Back then, you didn't just make the cross-Atlantic journey just for a vacation, right? It wasn't a weekend trip. It was obviously a huge undertaking, and you would only do something like that if you had a really important mission to accomplish.
Okay, and returning as the heroes of Treasure Templari are Cam and Amanda Thorne, and all these archaeological sites or engross them and trap them in these international intrigues. So for the listeners who may not have read your 10 previous books that include Cam and Amanda, can you tell us a little bit about the heroes of your Templars in America series?
Right. So Cam and Amanda. Cam is he's now a 40-something, but when I first started writing, he was 30-something. He's an attorney in Greater Boston who sort of lives in the town of Westford, northwest of Massachusetts. At the very beginning of the series, he stumbles upon this Westford Knight, spelled with a K, legend, and that's the legend of the Prince Henry Sinclair journey to North America that I just mentioned in 1398, 1399. He quickly becomes associated with Amanda. She is a British historian who ends up in America in the Westford area, and she is sort of there to act as custodian of the Westford Knight legend for a group of Europeans who feel that it's worth preserving. And anyway, one thing leads to another, and they end up becoming eventually romantically involved. But essentially, she brings the British perspective, the Europeans' perspective on this whole history, and he and she together drive around New England, looking at these different historical sites and artifacts, and try to figure out, what was really going on. While, of course, because these are fiction and it's sort of the formula, you need to have bad guys trying to stop them from finding out what's going on. Very similar to the formula in National Treasure or the Da Vinci Code. It's those kinds of books. But the idea is that the readers learn about this history and experience the history. At the same time, they're on a bit of a roller coaster ride in this fictional setting with Cameron and Amanda. So in this particular book, the missing panel in the Ghent Alterpiece, the one that we think is the map to the Holy Grail and the Templar treasure, it is discovered, and the person who discovers it enlists Cam and Amanda to help him understand and translate it, knowing that Cam and Amanda are experts now on the Knights Templar, and that the Templars seem to be very much related and involved in this mystery. This art, this person in the art world knows a lot about art, but does not necessarily know a lot about history and the history of the Templars. So again, he enlists Cameron and Amanda's aid to translate the painting. In the meantime, other groups are trying to get hold of the painting, because once it becomes known that it exists, now everyone wants to follow the trail and discover the treasure, whether it's the Holy Grail, the Templar treasure. What is the Templar treasure? Is it gold and silver? Is it religious artifacts such as the Ark of the Covenant? Is it the Holy Grail itself? Again, like we talked about, the Spear of Destiny, the True Cross, the Crown of Thorns. Is it something else having to do with early Christianity? Is it secret knowledge? I mean, all sorts of possibilities what the Templar treasure might be, but everybody, of course, wants it. In addition to the fact that people want the painting itself, because it's probably worth in the neighborhood of $400 or $500 million. It's a very famous painting, and it's been missing since 1934. So there's lots of people circling around trying to get hold of this painting, both for monetary reasons and for political reasons. And of course, that leads to that's sort of the ingredients that we put together to make our tasty, savory murder mystery meal in this story. But at the center of it, as they always seem to be, are Cameron and Amanda.
Okay, and is it Shelby who says to Cam, I've seen you on the History Channel? Is is Cam a little bit of an autobiographical character?
I always like so I am a lawyer by training, as is Cam. I like to tell people that Cam is a better looking, more intelligent, more athletic version of myself, and all the things I always wanted to be, taller and thinner and a full head of hair, that kind of stuff. But in some ways he is, but in many ways he's not. I mean, there's a lot of Cameron, for example, because I didn't want to make him too perfect, happens to be diabetic, and so everyone always assumes I must be diabetic, which I'm not. So there's a lot of things about Cameron that are not autobiographical, but the basic idea of this attorney in Greater Boston stumbling upon this mystery, it is very similar to the way it happened to me. I live, at the time when I started this, I lived in Westford, Massachusetts, and my daughter, who happened to be in fourth grade at the time, came home from school one day and said, we just learned about this people exploring America before Columbus, and I thought it was just a really neat story from my hometown, but I'd never heard about it before. And so I walked up the hill in the center of our town and went to the library and started doing some research on it, so I went down that rabbit hole back. It's probably been 13, 14 years ago, and I'm still ferreting around down in these dusty corners of history. It's been 9, 10 books later, and I'm still down there writing about it, researching it, in desperate need of a change of clothes and a shower, having been down there for so long. But I remain fascinated by this, much the same way Cameron is. Essentially what he is discovering are the same kind of things that I'm discovering, which is this whole possibility that there were waves of explorers coming to America before Columbus. And when you sort of step back and think about it, we know that the Norse came over, Leif Erikson, in the early years of the 11th century, 1001 to 1012 or 14, somewhere in that range, came back 3 or 4 different times. So we know they came across back then. We know they had the boats could do it. They did it. So why are people surprised that somewhere in that 500-year gap between Leif Erikson and Christopher Columbus that other people would have done the same thing? It's part of the human condition that we all watched Star Trek when we were kids, to seek out new life and new civilization, to boldly go where no one has gone before. Well, in this particular case, people had gone there before. So other people had maps. They had the Icelandic sagas. They had books written about the wonderful things that could be found across the Atlantic Ocean, whether it was a land of plenty, whether it was trading with the natives for fur, fishing, harvesting timber. There were some really compelling reasons to make the crossing. So there was good reasons to do it. They had motivation. They knew how to do it. Again, to me, it would have been surprising if nobody had done it. A lot more surprising than that people did. And the people who did do it probably kept it secret. There were economic advantages to keeping it secret, like somebody has your favorite fishing hole, you don't tell people about it. There are plenty of good reasons to keep this kind of thing quiet. And again, we're dealing with secret societies. And in the case of the Templars, not only were there economic reasons for keeping things quiet, but again, they were trying to get away from the long arm of the church. They had both economic reasons, because they wanted to keep their treasures away from the church. We know that in 1307, when the church came in and outlawed the Templars and raided their treasury in Paris, that they found an empty treasury. So that the Templars had somehow spirited away their treasures before the church and the King of France could get there and take it. So where did it all go? We still don't know the answer to that. One of the possibilities is America. But also they needed a safe haven, because, again, they figured at some point the church would turn on them, much as the church had done to the Cathars in the Provence region of France in something called the Albigensian Crusade in 1220 or so. This was not the first time the church turned on other Christians for being the wrong kinds of Christians, for being bad Christians, and wiped them out. They wiped out hundreds of thousands of Cathars in the Albigensian Crusade. Templars were fully aware of that, and they said to themselves, probably, look, we can't let that happen to us. At some point, the church is going to turn on us. We need to have an escape plan. We need to have a place to get to. We need to have a safe haven. So anyway, that's a very long answer to your question, but this is the kind of stuff that Cam and Amanda are learning about, the ways of explorers, not just Templars, but other explorers who we think came across the Atlantic. And I'm learning about it at the same time. So in that sense, it is autobiographical, because it's something that I had never known about. I was never taught, and I find it incredibly eye-opening, and it's become my passion. My family, they laugh at me. Whenever we go on vacation, all I want to do is go look at sites and artifacts like the Hunebedden, like the giant beds, that I think evidence ancient civilizations and what these civilizations might have done and where they might have gone.
Okay, and the bad guys in Treasure Templari are, I get to, some of the neo-Nazis, and they are trying to basically complete Hitler and Himmler's vision. So,
right.
They're also seeking more information, and get all the Cam and Amanda get kidnapped and all that kind of stuff goes on. Do you want to comment about the bad guys, or is that just not pretty self-explanatory?
Yeah, so I think it's important, and we all learned about World War II history. We learned about the Holocaust. We learned about Hitler and the Nazis, and we learned about, of course, Pearl Harbor. I don't think people realize how close it was to losing that, for the Allies to lose that war. I don't think people realize how close we were. There's a fascinating TV series, Man in the High Castle. Do you watch that, Mark? Are you familiar with that?
No, I haven't seen that one.
Okay, it's Man in the High. Basically, what it is it's based on a book. It's basically an entire series based on the possibility. It's modern day, but it's an alternative existence based on the fact that the Germans and the Japanese had won World War II. So the United States is occupied to the east of the Rockies by Germany, Nazi Germany, and to the west of the Rockies by Japan. And it's set during modern days, but under the rule of the Japanese and the Germans in continental America. People don't realize how close things were to the Axis powers winning World War II. Some commentators believe, had Hitler not been so obsessed with eliminating the Jews and other undesirables, quote unquote, had he not wasted so many resources on that, had he just focused on the war effort, he would have won the war. For example, he was convinced that research into the nuclear bomb, he considered that to be that particular field of science to be beneath the Nazis because it was a Jewish field of science, and he wanted nothing to do with it. And had he not taken that stance, it probably would have been the Germans who came up with the nuclear bomb first. And of course, who knows what would have happened if it had fallen into their hands? They were so obsessed with finding this technology from Atlantis and the magical technology of the Arma Christi. But they had the nuclear bomb pretty much at their fingertips. The people who ended up, working the nuclear bomb at the Manhattan Project in America, many of them had been spirited out of Europe, in particular Germany, at the beginning of the war. And so he had those people within his borders, and had he given more resources and more attention to it, the Nazis probably would have had the bomb before we did. So anyway, this particular group of the villains in my book are again, they're neo-Nazis, but they want to complete the mission that Hitler and Himmler began, but they want to be a little smarter about it. They're not necessarily they just try to be a little more savvy. Basically, they want a second chance at it. And so there's a technology that I won't get into because I don't want to ruin the story, but there's a technology out there, and again, they think that this map, this secret map, leads to this technology, and so their intent is to find the technology to allow them to finish what Hitler had begun. And so they're one of the villains in the story.
Okay, because I don't want to give away how too much more of the book, but I think the audience might find it interesting to look at just maybe you would just wet their whistle a little bit about the reproduction of the lost painting that was based on a photograph of it, and there's the different spire. Is that giving away too much, or?
Yeah, that's probably giving away too much. And so, but basically,
okay.
what is the characters? The characters, this is similar to Da Vinci Code, where the characters look at they study the painting for clues, and so our art experts in this book, they study the painting. There's a photograph of the lost panel that was done in the early 1900s, and so people work from that a little bit. It's black and white, so it's not exact. But again, in my book, of course, they find the original. So they're comparing the original to the photograph to see if there's any alterations one to the other, as if that might be a clue. So, but yeah, I don't think we need to get into that so much. I think what I would like to talk about, and to better answer your previous question, Mark, about the villains, one of the fascinating things, and one of the things I had a lot of fun exploring about this particular group of villains, these neo-Nazis, is they want to, the Fourth Reich that they want to create, they believe that Christianity is too weak a religion to be a true Nazi religion. And so, and I didn't realize this, I didn't realize that Himmler especially was very anti-Christian. In fact, he encouraged his SS officers to follow the old gods. And so there's some interesting historical photographs of, for example, when an SS officer got married, they would dance around the maypole, just like the old pagan celebrations. This whole Christianity idea of turn the other cheek and love thy neighbor, the Nazis are like, no. We want the old Thor, the hammer of Thor. We want the old gods. We want to take no prisoners. We don't like this Jesus, love thy neighbor stuff and turn the other cheek stuff. And so they thought Christianity was too weak a religion to be to be worthy of the Nazi elite. And so Himmler, even back in the 1930s and 40s, was pushing for a return to the old gods. And so that's an interesting aspect. So one of the things that the villains in this story do is they try to build a case against Christianity. And I think, Mark, some of the things you want to talk about, I don't know if you want to do it now, but things like the book Caesar's Messiah and things like an analysis of the Gospel of Mark and those kinds of things. The villains in my story try to undermine Christianity a bit as a way to blaze a path so that when they do take over, when Nazism does take over again, that along with it is the removal of Christianity as a world religion to be replaced by one of these old religions that emphasize the sort of power and strength and not this soft side, the soft wimpy side of Christianity where you turn the other cheek.
Yeah, we'll come back to Caesar's Messiah in a little bit, but you do work in the Norse poems and legends from Thule and the Magic Land and all the stuff that fit into the Nazi philosophy of the time. And so you have that developed throughout the book with the character Katrina and
Katarina, named after the figure skater Katharina Witt, the East German figure skater. Remember her? Katharina Witt. Yes. So she was this character. This neo-Nazi character, Katharina, is named after, of course, the German figure skater Katharina Witt.
Okay. And going, shifting back from the legends of yore to the Duke of Burgundy that you brought up at the beginning. He features in the painting as well as some of the cathedral of the Holy Blood Basilica and Saint Pharaohs, and there's other artwork in there to contrast with the Norse legends, but you have photos of the black and white checker floor and the duality theme that is a mainstay of the Templar philosophy. So what was the Duke of Burgundy's role in the 1420s? We know that he was friends with Jan van Eyck as
right. So first of all, I kept reading about the Duke of Burgundy, and it took me 3 or 4 times before I finally said, "This guy's just a duke. Like, how important could he be?" And then I realized I did some research, and he was actually the king. I don't know why he's called the Duke of Burgundy, but back then he was the king of a huge swath of land in the middle of Europe, basically what we now know today as Belgium, the Netherlands, and most of France. So I keep reading about this guy who's a duke, and I think, all right, he's a duke. How important could he be? It turns out he was actually the king. So right away I'm like, all right, I got to pay more attention to this guy. So he ruled. He lived in 1396, I think he was born, and he ruled all the way through the early and mid 1400s. What's important about him is, like you mentioned, he was good friends with Jan van Eyck. In fact, he was the patron of Van Eyck, and he's the one who sort of commissioned this Ghent Alterpiece painting. He was Van Eyck's son's godfather. But what's important about this Duke of Burgundy is he was obsessed with the Holy Grail himself. He was a big student of alchemy and esoterica, part of all the mystery schools. Basically, when you think about the Templars and the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians, and this guy was right up that alley. He would have been front and center at all these events, all these meetings, all these people in the medieval times and going forward up until today, all these men mostly, but people who were fascinated by the ancient mystery schools and wanted to learn about alchemy and the Holy Grail. That's him, okay? In fact, he started his own order called the Order of the Golden Fleece. This was in the early 1400s, and a lot of the members of the outlawed Templar families, a lot of those members became part of this group, okay? And so we see in the Basilica, in the St. Bavo's Cathedral, where the Ghent Alterpiece is, lots of different clues as to the origins, the Templar origins of that cathedral. The ground floor, the basement, was actually a Templar chapel before it became the cathedral. And then even in the artwork and in a lot of the decoration and stuff, it's a lot of Templar clues in that cathedral. And again, during this time period, the Templars have been outlawed. So the idea that we would have Templar iconography and symbology in a Christian church is a little bit surprising and contradictory. And it tells us that this guy, the Duke of Burgundy, who was essentially the one who commissioned this church to be built and decorated the way it was, he, even though he was a quote-unquote good Christian, he believed in a lot of the things that the Templars believed in, and he was fascinated by a lot of the things the Templars were fascinated in. In particular, I think this whole idea of the Holy Grail and alchemy and the Templar treasure. So that seems to be the theme that carries through this, and I think he's the one who requested that Van Eyck embed these Templar secrets and these Holy Grail secrets in the painting. Again, he was the patron of Van Eyck at the time Van Eyck was painting this stuff. So he's a key part of this whole story.
Yeah, maybe now we might be able to work in that with the duality theme. You also get into the separation of church and state. You get the
that's an important theme.
Caesar's Messiah. Caesar's Messiah that you mentioned earlier about the one passage from was it like Romans 13 that is like just be obedient to what the government tells you.
Yeah. All right. So let's start with the whole duality thing, because
okay.
When and then we'll get to Caesar's Messiah at the end of that. I think we'll circle back to it. But one of the things I spent a long time on in this book is looking at we're trying to find clues as to what the Templars really believed. That to me that carries through all of my books. What did the Templars find when they were in Jerusalem? How did it affect their beliefs and their religious beliefs? And eventually those things cause them to be considered heretics by the church. But what was it that they believed? What did they find? What were those beliefs? And then, of course, what happened to their treasure? But let's start with their beliefs. Whatever it was that they believed was contrary to the church teachings. I think what it was, it all goes back to something called dualism or duality. What that really is balance. The idea that society needs balance in order to be healthy. That it has to have a balance between masculine and feminine, between church and state, between just nature demands hot and cold, light and dark. We see this all the way through, and you see this a lot in Freemasonry and in their ritual, the black and white checkered floor. And anyway, this is a common concept in many yin and yang in Asian religions, for example. The church didn't necessarily abide by that. The church would say, we don't need masculine and feminine. We need masculine. We don't need church and state. We just need church. Okay, so there was an imbalance there that the church was perfectly fine with. We don't need science. We just need faith, right? We're not going to heal people through medicine. We're going to heal them through prayer. Okay, and the Templars are saying, well, wait a second. Faith is important, but so is medicine and science. And so you need balance. We need the feminine influence to help make ourselves a healthy society, and the church is like, no, we don't. And so the Templars, I think, were looking for, again, dualism or balance. And so I started looking at their secret seals, the things that they used in their secret correspondence. And then, of course, these seals had images. And these images start to tell, I think, give us an insight as to what the Templars really believed. And the first one I looked at was the one that many of your listeners probably are familiar with, and that is the common Templar seal or symbol of two knights on one horse. And we're taught or we're told that this was the symbol of the poor fellow soldiers of Christ, which is what the Templars really called themselves, because they were poor. It was a poor order, and therefore we couldn't afford enough horses. We had to share our horses because we were so poor. We were servants of God. Well, the reality is nothing could be further from the truth. The Templars were wealthier than most monarchs. In fact, they were the bankers to most sovereigns in Europe. They lent money to kings. They were the world's first bankers, the world's first multinational corporation. They owned hundreds of commanderies. They had literally, the expression more money than God is attributed to them. They were incredibly wealthy. They were anything but poor. And in fact, Rule 51 of the order specifically says, quote, to each knight brother we grant 3 horses and 1 squire. So every knight had 3 horses and a squire. There was no reason 2 knights had to share 1 horse. Each knight had 3 of his own. So you get this whole idea that they were sharing a horse, never made sense to me from a historical perspective because I know how wealthy they were. So what's this whole idea with 2 knights on 1 horse? Well, I think what's really going on there is if you look at it from a more allegorical perspective, getting back to this whole idea of balance and the importance in nature of equal and opposite and harmony, is that the 2 men on 1 horse represent the opposite, seemingly contradictory missions of the order. On the one hand, they were religious monks, but on the other hand, they were fierce warriors. And yet these 2 things, even though they were opposites, were in balance with each other. There were 2 men, the monk and the fighter, balanced together on 1 horse. And I think that's what was going on with that symbol. It wasn't about we're too poor to afford a second horse. It was that these two, each side of the same coin, the warrior and the praying monk, could exist together in balance on this one horse and still have a healthy order, and that's really what society needs. Society needs the balance and the dualism, not just one or the other. And so based on that, I started looking at other Templar seals, and I started wondering whether other seals might also be related to this concept of dualism. And the second seal I found, this is the one that to me is the most compelling of all, features the pagan god Abraxas, Abraxas. And if your listeners want to Google that quickly, you'll see that what pops up is this fascinating image of this pagan deity which has the head of a rooster, the body of a man, and the legs of serpents, two serpents as legs, and the deity is holding a whip in one hand and either a shield or a sun in the other. And Abraxas, by the way, the name Abraxas, it's a pagan deity worshipped most notably by the Cathars of southern France. I mentioned earlier the Albigensian Crusade, where hundreds of thousands of the wrong kinds of Christians were wiped out. Well, that's who these people are. These are the wrong kinds of Christians, because even though they were Christians, they also believed in this Abraxas god. They believed Abraxas created God, Yahweh. Like, God created the heavens and the earth. But who created God? Well, they believed this deity called Abraxas created God. And they believed that Abraxas was symbolic of the natural world. The name Abraxas is formed using the first letter of the Greek name of each of the 7 classical planets, the planets visible to the naked eye: the Sun, the Moon, Mars, Venus, Jupiter, Saturn, and Mercury. Okay, so that's where the name Abraxas comes from. But it's the natural world. It's the pagan god. It's not Yahweh. It's nature. Okay, and again, the Cathars were eventually wiped out by the church for these beliefs. But their god, the god above God, Abraxas, the pagan deity, this deity, for some reason, is featured by the Templars on their secret seal. Remember, the Templars are supposed to be an army of the church, Christians, and yet they have a pagan deity on their secret seal. Remember the old I Love Lucy show? And Ricky says to Lucy, "Lucy, you got some splaining to do," right? That's what's going on when I saw that. So I thought, all right, someone's got some splaining to do. Why is there a pagan deity on the secret seal of this Christian order? And I think the answer is because they understood the importance of the natural world, the balance, the dualism of this deity of Abraxas, the dualism that's represented by, for example, the serpents, which we consider to be evil in Christianity. No, the serpent is a symbol of wisdom in the ancient pagan religions. And so the Templars, knowing that, secretly use this symbol. So there's other symbols as well, but the idea is that all the symbols I found, all the seals that I found, all reflect this concept of dualism and balance. And this, I think, is what the Templars believed, and this, I think, is what got them in trouble with the church.
Okay. And going back...
You're supposed to clap at the end of that. You're supposed to say, "Bravo, Mark, bravo, Brody, well done. You figured it out. Thank you." Come on, where's my round of applause?
It was great, and did have one of my friends saying how much she is really getting out of your lecture. So, but just to take your doctoral thesis back, 1,300 years to, like the 1st century AD, when there really wasn't a balance. When the Gospels were being written, you do introduce that Caesar's Messiah book,
right.
And that's you're kind of building up to this balance from the Abraxas concept to it got lost with the passage from Romans about just be a slave to the government masters. So what's happening there?
There's almost like two separate things. So the Caesar Messiah stuff, that in my take on that, in my Treasure Templari novel, I use that more. That's more something that the villains, the neo-Nazis, are using as a way to sort of undermine Christianity. They come across this book. It's a book called Caesar's Messiah by Joseph Atwill, and Atwill makes a really compelling argument that Jesus was not a real historical figure, that instead he was invented by the Roman imperial family, the Flavians, because at the time there was sort of a popular prophecy that the Savior was coming. The Jews of that time, for various reasons, believed that the Savior was coming. They were ready to rebel against Rome. They were waiting for a messianic leader behind whom they could rally. So what the Flavians did, the royal imperial family did, is they gave them what they wanted. They gave them Jesus, and Atwill argues it was a fictional person. There really was no real Jesus, but that they gave him this prophet, but they watered him down. They made him sort of passive because they wanted the Jews at the time to follow a passive leader. They almost like they created an uprising and then they neutered it by themselves. And the evidence Atwill uses talks about how even though the religion was supposedly founded by a Jew, that a lot of its structure, the sacraments, its college of bishop, the word pontiff, they're all based on Roman, not Jewish traditions. And in fact, the only writing that we have of Jesus, only writer at the time, the contemporary writer who actually mentions Jesus, is Josephus, who was adopted by the royal imperial family, the Flavians. So the only source that actually talks about Jesus was actually the adopted son of the emperor, who was trying to undermine, according to Atwill, the idea, trying to undermine the Jewish uprising. He also talks about in Romans 13:2-6, I think it is, that how the Roman judges and magistrates were actually good people. That it's the citizens who are wrong for opposing their oppressors. He gives a whole long quote about really if you're going to be a good citizen, you should obey the taxpayer, you should obey your overlord, you should obey your occupier. It's quite an interesting concept for a freedom fighter to be arguing to his followers. You should obey the occupying force, obey the Roman taxpayers, obey the Roman occupiers. It's a strange thing. You don't usually see that in revolutions. And yet these writings, supposedly, this is by the Apostle Paul, these writings that Atwill talks about, seem to undermine the cause of a revolution. And so in my story, the neo-Nazis sort of use this book. They want to use this book as a way to teach their followers going forward that really Jesus was just fictional, that he was fabricated by the Roman royal family as a way to undermine the Jewish uprising. So it's an interesting concept, and I'm not sure. I'm not an expert in Bible studies to be able to tell you how accurate this was, but it's a fascinating argument, and at least in my book, some of my characters, I think it carries a lot of weight.
Yeah, but in Scott Walter's Akhenaten to the Founding Fathers, he brings up the Talpiot tomb, and yeah, there's some evidence in there that there's like someone really special was buried there, and it's, it sounds like it could be Jesus and Mary Magdalene,
right.
and that, but it seems like when the Crusaders or Templars came out of the Holy Land, they knew something that seems to maybe contradict the concept that is in Caesar's Messiah, that Jesus is just a made-up person, but we don't know exactly what the Templars saw or the hidden treasures that they have. So, but yeah, it just seems like the Templars are more certain of something than previous generations and what we know today.
Right. So one of the possibilities, and Scott Walter talks about this a lot in the Talpiot tomb, is that there's some evidence that in the tomb was, Jesus and Mary Magdalene and their children and the extended family, and that obviously if Jesus was in a tomb, then he wasn't resurrected, and if he wasn't resurrected, then that would be quite a thing for the Templars to sort of leave Jerusalem with, that evidence or that understanding. That would bring them back to Europe and obviously have a conversation with the Pope at the time saying, hey, the stuff that you're teaching, isn't completely right. We have evidence that Jesus wasn't resurrected, that we found his bones or whatever it is. And that actually ties into something else that my villains in my book talk about, again, when they're trying to undermine Christianity, and that is the Gospel of Mark. There are two versions of the Gospel of Mark. There's what's called the short version, in which the Mary Magdalene and the Virgin Mary and the other Mary go into the tomb after Jesus has died, and while in there, they encounter a young man dressed in white who announces that Jesus is resurrected, and the women flee the tomb and then don't say anything to anybody, and that's where the earliest versions of the Gospel of Mark that date back to the 4th century, they sort of end right there. Okay, that's the story. That's called the short ending of Mark. But the King James Version and most other versions of the Bible have an additional 12-verse passage where this has been added on to sometime after the 4th century. And in this these additional passages called the long version of Mark, they go into much more detail about how Jesus actually appeared to the apostles himself and announced his resurrection. I've been resurrected, he says. Well, that causes a lot of Bible scholars and skeptics to say, well, hold on a second. The original version of Mark says nothing about a resurrection, or nothing about Jesus saying he was resurrected. There is the mention of the man in the white robe saying there was a resurrection, but it's the long version of Mark that goes into a lot more detail, and that causes many Bible skeptics to say, if we take the short version of Mark at its word, there's really not a lot of evidence of the resurrection, and that's where if the Templars did find the bones of Jesus in Talpiot tomb, you can sort of tie those two things together, the short version of Mark and then the bones, and the Templars could have come out of there saying, you know what, we don't think he was really resurrected, which is fine. He still was a prophet. He still could have been the Son of God. He still could have had all these other great qualities and all these great teachings, and just because he wasn't resurrected, we can still be Christians and have Christianity. Of course, the church wasn't necessarily going to go for that, and so that might have been the problem between and the butting heads between the church and the Templars. This whole idea of was he resurrected or not, but that all comes from your comment about what they may or may not have found in Talpiot tomb and how that ties into both the short and long versions of the Gospels of Mark.
you know, it's just all very interesting, and I think one of the it really wasn't planned having you on this week, and Gary Wayne is next week. But just there's your information might be or interpretation of the Templars might be about 180-degree difference from Gary, but it seems like the Templars.
How so? Which part of his which part of?
He's looking at Gary is going to be looking at secret societies as more of a nefarious group, and you're presenting them more as a spiritually illuminated group of people, and it seems like if they have brought proof of Jesus out of the Talpiot tomb, or where the churches, the sepulcher, or what one of the various holy sites in Jerusalem, it seems that they're preserving the truth. I think most of us would agree that's a good thing.
It's
just
so,
interesting.
I'm not sure everyone would, but I agree with that. Yes.
Yeah. It's just later. That aspect of a secret order, or like the Duke of Burgundy's the Order of the Golden Fleece. There's like a secretiveness to it, but they're also doing good things. Maybe somewhere down the road from the Crusades, things changed, and they got crossed over into something far different than the original concepts holding the warrior monks together. But it's just really interesting, and it's kind of like an unintended balance over the next couple, or this week and next week.
Well, so one of the things where I eventually get to in my book, as a sort of a theme of the story, one of the possibilities, and again, because I'm writing fiction, it allows me to have, as an example, I can have a character, and I mentioned the neo-Nazi Katharina. She can believe certain things, like she can believe that Christianity is too weak for the Nazis as a religion, and then she can go into and research, so she can sort of carry that water for me. It doesn't necessarily mean that I believe that Christianity is a weak religion, or that I believe that Caesar's Messiah, the argument is real or not. But I can explore those possibilities through one of my characters, and so that's the advantage I have in fiction, is I can do that. So similarly, one of the possibilities, when we talk about secret societies and are they good or are they bad, one of the possibilities, and before we can answer that question, we have to think back and why were societies secret to begin with, and the reason for that oftentimes was because if the church found out what they were doing, whether it was studying astronomy, or was it studying medicine, or studying whatever it was, that the church didn't like a lot of the things these people were doing, okay? They didn't like science. They didn't like anything that questioned the primacy of the church. And so people had to do these things in secret. So this whole idea of the separation of church and state that we end up with here in America with our Bill of Rights, well, who was many of the founding fathers were Freemasons. And I'm not going to get too deep into this now, but many people agree with me when I say that the Freemasons inherited many of their teachings and many of their beliefs from the Templars. And, of course, the Templars were Exhibit A in what kinds of bad things happen when you don't have a separation of church and state. They were a product. They're being outlawed and tortured and imprisoned was a product of the Pope and the King of France getting together and saying, hey, let's outlaw these guys, take their money, take their lands, imprison them, let's get together. Because there was not a separation of church and state then, because of the church had so much power at that point to do what it wanted. And so, the Templars understood the importance of a separation of church and state, which I think is what, most Americans would believe is important to this day. And so, why were the Templars and why were the Order of the Golden Fleece and today the Freemasons, why are there secret societies? Well, the answer to that is because oftentimes if you do these things out in public, you are persecuted for it. And so in my story, one of the possibilities, what is the Templar treasure that was hidden back then here in America? Well, maybe the treasure itself isn't monetary. It's this concept of liberty and duality and balance and all those human rights that we talk about. But maybe that's the kind of thing that was rooted in the early days of the Templars and grew into what we now know as this great experiment in democracy here in the United States of America. So that's one of the possibilities, is that Templar treasure is really our Bill of Rights.
And with the what you're talking about, since you're a lawyer, and the Constitution and Bill of Rights, the founding documents, it does have a balance. Separation of church and state, and just if some of the listeners are, hopefully, they're realizing that, like me, where if you do look at the balance in this founding documents, it almost seems like the Masonic influence of the writers were looking back to their forefathers, like the Templars had kind of got this idea going, and we're really trying to find a balance between what they believe versus the authoritarianism of the early 14th century church that persecuted them. And it just and like 400 years later, they get their revenge. Oh, hey, we have a place here where there's balance. So we're kind of free from you.
Yeah, it's revenge. I'm not sure it's revenge as much as just an evolution. These kinds of concepts take time, hundreds of years. But just the idea of valuing the individual rights, as opposed to back then where whether it was if you were a serf, your lord could do whatever he wanted to, or if you were accused by the church or something, that there was no due process, or all these individual rights that we now take for granted. But this was an evolution, the Enlightenment and the Renaissance and all these concepts, all these ideas. A lot of these ideas, people forget that Europe was the backwards part of the world back in the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th century, 11th century, the Dark Ages, and it was the Middle East that was progressive and enlightened and had science and freedoms and stuff. And so when the Templars left Europe in the early parts of the 1100s and came over to the Middle East, their eyes were opened up to all these concepts that they had never heard of before, never seen before. These ideas of liberty and individual rights and duality and balance, all that stuff. And so they brought that stuff back with them to Europe. The early roots of the Enlightenment period and the Renaissance, that comes from, many of those ideas come from the Templars and the exposure they had in the Middle East. And so again, we think of it today as they're so backwards over there, and they are a lot of the things that they do, obviously. But it wasn't always that way. 1,000 years ago, it was the other way around. But anyway, so the big concept here is that maybe, as I said before, maybe the real treasure of the Templars was their belief in things, and it led to things like the Bill of Rights and this experiment in democracy. Mm-hmm. And maybe that was what they brought over to America, even more than their physical treasures.
It's a point well taken. And speaking of all of this balance, one of the characters in your book is part of seems like it's becoming a theme for Nightlight. There's Bruce's cat's name is Squidward.
I had no idea what you were talking about, but it did. Why is SpongeBob?
Why is SpongeBob becoming a reoccurring theme on Nightlight? When Mark Louisiak was with us a few weeks ago, he's talking about interviewing Clancy Brown for his Shawshank Redemption book, and it's I don't know what's going on with that one. That Squidward just kind of caught me off guard, but it was
to shed some light on that for the listeners. One of my characters, he's sort of a nerdish type character, but he's got a cat named Squidward, who he named after because he's a big SpongeBob fan, even though he's a grown adult, but he loves SpongeBob, and so he named his cat Squidward after one of the characters in SpongeBob. And again, one of the fun things about being able to write fiction is you can do stuff like that and have sort of quirky characters. And I'm not going to get into what it is, but it may be that the Templar treasure is buried on land that he inherited from his grandfather. And so, one of the things that happens is a fight over this land to try to have access to be able to dig up what they think might be the treasure. But he and Squidward are standing guard over the land. So I didn't see that one coming, Mark. I didn't know where you're going with that. Good job. You got me on that.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess I just wasn't wearing my tinfoil helmet for that. Moment that idea developed. But as you write your books, this might be a moment to help authors who are kind of stuck at the moment. Hit that wall and don't know what to do with their work. This might be like a teaching moment. But since you're an attorney and you're always, it seems like you're trying to just doing a little bit of profiling of just people you're dealing with in the office or along the street, and your books are filled with these little anecdotes about the characters. It's like in the book we're talking about today. You talk about bankers hate taking risks. They like things just being neat and orderly. And Katrina says, just makes the observation: luck runs out, skill is constant.
Yeah, so these little pithy my wife teases me. She calls them my little pithy statements that I like to, little aphorisms or little, So I do like to put those kinds of things. I think those add to the reading experience. I think when you're reading, people like to be entertained, of course, but they also like to be a little bit educated as they go along. And so if you can have a character make a statement and the reader says, yeah, or nod, or just say, yeah. So I think what you're getting on is, what's the advice to other, younger writers that I would give, and that is, I take copious notes in my life. Like whenever somebody says something, or I hear something, or I read something that I think is worthy of remembering, I write it down. So my house, my office especially, is littered with little yellow sticky, things. And then when it comes time to write, I have a stack of these little notes I've made, whether it's as I get out of the shower, or after I go for a jog in the morning, or in the car as I'm driving, I'm scribbling things out. I have a stack of these little sticky notes, basically, that have little thoughts or sayings or insights. And I try to have characters, incorporate those into the story. And I just think that adds a layer of richness to the story that may not have been there before. Not that I'm so insightful or so so much smarter than other people that I know these things, but when I hear them, I write them down, because no one can remember that stuff. 6 months later, you go to write the book, and who knows what it was you heard back in February. But so I try to write that stuff down. So I just think that anytime you can add that another layer of richness to your writing, whether it's descriptions or whether it's insights or whatever it is, it just adds to the experience. I wish I was better at that. I always feel like, every time I do one of those, I think, I wish I'd done more of those. I wish there was one every paragraph. I don't have that many, unfortunately, but I liked I think another one. Katerina says, arrogance is a roadblock on the highway to wisdom. Yes. Yes, I heard that once and wrote it down. I can't remember who said it, but that's the other thing. So Katerina, even though she is the villain, and that's another thing I think some young writers may not have mastered, that I've learned over the years, and that is that you don't want your villains to be completely villainous. You want them to have admirable qualities. You want readers to at least maybe not like them, but at least appreciate where they're coming from. And similarly, you don't want your heroes to be, so virtuous that they're comic book characters. Even heroes have to have flaws and have to make mistakes and have to have things that maybe the reader doesn't like about them. Because again, that's the world. That's the real world. There's very few people in the world who are all black or all white from a moral point of view. Most people are somewhere in the middle. Maybe they're 70% good and 30% bad, or vice versa. But there's very few people who are, completely evil or completely good. And so it's important not to populate your books with comic book characters who are just one way and not the other. So I think nuance is important. And so the Katerina character, she's probably not all that likable, but she's at least a little bit admirable in the fact that she's accomplished a lot of important things, and some of her insights may make you say, yeah, that's an interesting point. So even though her we don't agree with what she's trying to accomplish, we do appreciate some of the things she thinks and does.
Mm-hmm. Another interesting aspect of your work is you do include science. It's not presented as only like Newton and Einstein and Tesla could understand it. It's just it's just stuff that just kind of pushes the reader a little bit more to understand the concepts of introducing more proof of something like Atlantis. And one of the things that's stuck out to me is the concept of nostophilia with the from your echoes of Atlantis with the cougars swimming to Pompano Beach. I think it's the eels. I mean, swimming out to. Yeah.
The eels congregating in the middle of So nostophilia is a concept. It comes from the same word as nostalgia. And essentially, what it is that embedded in certain animals is this instinctive desire to return to their native homeland, to their ancestral homeland. And what we have in the case of both North American eels and European eels is that when it comes time to spawn, they're freshwater animals. They come down the rivers and streams of North America and of Europe, and they go out into the Atlantic Ocean, and they swim out and they meet in the middle along the North Atlantic ridge, and they meet the cousins from North America and the cousins from Europe. They meet in the middle at an area that we think may have been the ancient homeland of Atlantis. And the idea is that at some point back in their history, the eels remember that being their homeland, and that when Atlantis collapsed, these freshwater eels, which probably lived in streams and rivers on Atlantis, had no choice but to swim through the salt water to get back to land, whether it's North America or Europe, but that still thousands of years later they go back there to spawn together. And we have a similar thing with the butterflies off the northern coast of South America, where thousands and thousands of them fly north out towards the mid-Atlantic ridge, and they start circling around and around where they think they're supposed to be an island, and there's not. And eventually these butterflies just run out of they collapse and they fall into the sea and they die. But apparently this nostophilia, this instinct, is even stronger than the survival instinct because these butterflies just fly out to do this. So so there's obviously the science that goes into some of this stuff. I thought you were going to talk about the whole hydrogen possibility of turning hydrogen salt water into energy that I talk about. An inventor named John Canzius back in 2007 was experimenting with radio waves as a way to treat cancer. I thought that's where you're going with that.
Oh, no, I just thought it was another, just the science that you do introduce. I don't. It's behavioral, generational behavior. It's kind of like human profiling a little bit. You're just kind of looking at. We have documentation of how these animals behave. But why are they going swimming so far to a place that no longer exists? It sounds like there has to be a reason. What is it? and your explanation is as good as any other that's out there. It's just one of those interesting aspects that you introduced to your book. You do have the pyramid saltwater thing. If you want to get into that in the last.
Well, actually, let me reply to what you just said, Mark, because I think what you're saying is a really important point, and probably the question I get more often than any other question is, why is it that you're sort of solving these riddles when no one's been able to solve them before? Why is it that all of a sudden this is coming out, your research, and other people, I'm not alone, but people like Scott Walter and others, but why is this coming out now and it hasn't come out yet? And so there's really two answers to that. One is the Internet. Having the Internet, you couldn't have done this 25 or 30 years ago because there's just no way to access all the different pieces of information that you need, much less be able to communicate via email with other researchers. So this world was just too large back then. There was too much data that you couldn't put your fingers on back then that you can do now. But I think also I attribute a lot of it to the importance of a liberal arts education. And when I say that, you mentioned science. So, I'm not a scientist, but I did take science classes as a liberal arts college student, and so I have a decent amount of knowledge in science. But when you look at these mysteries, you can't just take one discipline, academic discipline, and expect to solve it. You can't be just an archaeologist and only look at the things that come out of the ground. You also need to look at maps, so you need to be a cartographer. You need to be like Scott Walter and be a geologist and look at stone. You need to be a scientist and look at some of the science behind this stuff. You need to be a linguist and look at some of the language evolution. You need to be a historian, of course. You need to be a religious scholar to understand the religious aspects of this. But my point is, you need to be able to look at this using 8 or 10 or 12 different academic disciplines in order to put all the pieces of the puzzle together. It's not all just archaeology. That's not the only way. That's not the only piece of evidence that you're going to find here. And so it really does take someone with a liberal arts education, and more importantly, somebody who's not so rigid in their thinking that they think that only their particular field of study has all the answers. And that's what we run into a lot is, I know a historian who insists if it wasn't written down in a book someplace, it can't really have happened. Well, not everybody wrote things down. The Native American culture has oral history. Well, that's not written down. I don't care. Well, you're just being closed-minded now. Okay, the Native American version of what happened in America, their oral history is incredibly important, and I would argue just as, if not more, accurate than our written history. Okay, we all know that written history can be inaccurate. So the oral history they consider sacred. They are very careful with it. It's sacred to them, and so it tends to be very accurate. Anyway, my point is this whole in order to understand what's going on, in order really to get to the bottom of this, you need to look at it through lots of different intellectual disciplines. It's not just history. It's not just archaeology. It's not just linguistics. It's not just religion. It's not just geology. It's not just science. It's all sorts of different things. And in this particular case, we looked at biology with these eels and these butterflies, and that shed a lot of light into the possibilities where Atlantis was and evidence that it did exist.
Yeah, Dave, we have 10 minutes left.
Wow, okay. Time flew, wow.
Yeah, what are some new directions that non-mainstream writing is taking, and maybe a follow-up question is, do you have some upcoming lectures or presentations, appearances, road trips, something
sure.
like that?
So my first novel, which was a legal thriller, came out about 20 years ago, late 1999, just almost 20 years ago. And back then it was before digital, Kindle and Nook didn't exist. And back then the big thing was, to try to get book signings at the local Barnes and Noble or Border store, and that was really the way you moved books. Like that was your chance to interact with fans, to get your name out there. People wanted to get autographed copies to give as gifts, and that for a long time that's essentially what I did as a young author, and of course that's changed a lot. Today, probably 90% of the books that I sell are digital as opposed to paper books. There is no more Borders anymore. There's probably only half as many Barnes and Nobles. I can't remember the last time I was at one of them doing a book signing. I don't even bother anymore, just because people don't go there anymore. People buy their books online or digitally, and so that whole thing has changed dramatically. And so for writers, it's a reflection of the way readers experience their books. Probably most of your readers read digitally now. And to be honest, as much as I love the paper, the feel of a paper book in my hands, I don't blame them. And one of the things that I do in my novels, even though they're fiction, I include images of the sites and the artifacts and the artwork that I talk about, because I think it's important for the readers to understand, I'm not making that stuff up, that even though the book is fiction, these artifacts and this painting and this site, they're real, and you can see them here. And the great thing about being able to do it digitally is those can be high-resolution color photographs. I think that enhances the experience instead of a grainy black and white picture in what it would have been, what it is even today if you were to buy a paperback version of one of my books. Now instead, if you happen to read it digitally, you can really get in there and see the detail of the photograph and the image. So that's changed a lot as well. And I remember reading the Da Vinci Code and getting on my computer and trying to find pictures of the paintings Dan Brown was talking about, and just so I wanted to look at them myself. And so right away I said, if I ever do something like that, if I ever write a book like that, I'm going to include images. And I don't think most fiction writers do that still, but I've done that for all 9 books in this series, and I think it really enhances the experience. But that's something that's a change that I imagine other, it's no more expensive to do it that way from a publication point of view, from a production point of view, again, because it's all digitized. Anybody can drop a PDF photo into a file, so it's it doesn't add to the difficulty or expense of producing the book. So that's a change, I think. But mostly, I think the change is the reading habits of most people. That most people do it digitally, and of course that it just didn't exist 12, 15 years ago at all.
Okay, and are you going to be speaking at any Masonic lodges?
Sorry, the second half of your question, yeah. So a lot of what I do give a lot of lectures at Masonic lodges, a lot of lectures at historical societies. I drive around. I was at a Masonic lodge last night. I do find I'm not a Freemason myself. I do find that a number of Freemasons are interested in this material because of the tie between the Freemasons historically and the Knights Templar, and I think that this stuff resonates with many members of Masonic lodges because they are trying to understand why they do some of their ritual, why some of their symbology is what it is, and oftentimes those answers are not apparent. And then when they start looking back into the history and into the Knights Templar motivation, some of this stuff starts to make a little more sense. So I find that that's a group of readers who are very interested in the subject matter. So again, I do a lot of those lectures. Mostly I talk to people, writing groups. I talk to historical societies. I talk to I talk to high schools a lot. We have not yet gotten to the point where this stuff is taught as part of the mainstream curriculum in American schools. I think we're getting close to that point. I think that more and more people realize that this whole idea of Christopher Columbus, that yesterday we celebrated Columbus Day, or we recognized Columbus Day. Many people didn't celebrate it, obviously. People recognize it. But, the idea that he was the first person to cross the Atlantic, I think that's becoming more and more the cause for people to roll their eyes and say, come on, let's get past that. And even if he was the first one across, he's not really a heroic figure, not something that we want to have as a role model based on the way he treated the Native Americans once he got here. We can do better. We can find better heroes than that as a society.
Right, and you have more and more people just easily getting these holidays passed, and they're just calling it Indigenous Peoples Day.
Right. Look. Ironically, Columbus Day this year was only one day after October 13th, which is the day the Templars were outlawed, 1307, unlucky Friday the 13th. Yeah. The Native American perspective on this, we got probably a couple minutes so I can quickly get this in. One of the really fascinating things and fulfilling things is to have Native American tribal leaders tell me that what we think happened did. They tell me that Prince Henry Sinclair and the Knights Templar were here before Columbus, and they built the Newport Tower, and they left all these carvings around New England, and the Native American oral history in New England confirms that, okay? And one of the arguments that they always make is, look, we know this happened because it's part of our oral history, but more importantly, who else do you think could have possibly how else could they have come over here unless they came in peace, unless they came respectfully? Back then, there was no way. There were too many Native Americans. There was no way that a group of Europeans could fight their way onto the continent. Now, the Pilgrims were welcomed here because earlier Europeans had come over in peace and done so respectfully. But the Native Americans make the argument, I think it's very compelling, is the first Europeans that came over here came in friendship. And that's why later Europeans, like the Pilgrims, were welcomed. But it was the first group that came over, and they came over and they had a shared set of values. They came over and they treated the Native Americans with respect and with dignity. And if we're going to celebrate Columbus Day as a holiday, it should be with an eye towards that kind of behavior, the treatment with dignity and respect, and not the way later explorers came over here with an idea to enslave and corrupt and take advantage of. That's not the role models we want to be teaching our children, I don't think.
Right, and we're down to just under 2 minutes. The earlier the Prince Henry Sinclair is something we get into another time, and one of my favorite topics is the St. Brendan voyage, and when Greg was on with Barbara last night, he was talking about there's an estimated 100 million Native American population here. It's like with that size group of people and 100 people climbing off the Mayflower, you're pretty much outnumbered. So exactly. You better be on your best behavior. So, but we're down to a minute. Barbara's telling me we need to wrap up. But thank you so much, Dave, for being our guest tonight. We'll have to do it again sometime soon when you get your new book out. And
my pleasure, Mark. I would love to do that. Yeah, I really enjoy. I love the fact that you're such a knowledgeable and passionate host, and so I always enjoy being on with you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We like having you as a guest. So, yeah, Barbara, we have a busy week. We have a special show. We're going to pre-record on Friday, and Barbara's going to be on a show. Has a show tomorrow night with Mary Joyce at 9 to 10, and another show Thursday night. So busy week. But thanks, Dave, and we'll see everyone tomorrow night.